Yeah. So as I said that this is the webinar which are conducting by KBS. So what is 1464? So ISO 1464 is nothing but it's a family under the ISO programs. We have more than 10,000 ISO standards which are applicable here, and ISO 1464 is one of the fundamental standards which we talk about when we are talking about carbon reductions, greenhouse gas emissions, and the reporting of that same. So this ISO 1464 is it has started development way back in 2002, and there are various entities which were involved in its development, like WBCSD, which is and ISO WBCSD, as well as if I'm not wrong, IEA was also involved. So what is the key objective of this standard was, to be a policy neutral. When I say a policy neutral, it means it is not biased towards any particular program. So now that we are talking of net zero and decarbonization, and it is one of the most important topics in this current year as well as going forward, ISO 1464 forms the base of these mechanisms, or I would say on in these subjects. So if I move go next. So if you see the ISO applications of ISO 1460 family, when I'm saying ISO 1460 family, it means it has got a various substandards under that. We call it ISO 1464 1, ISO 1464 2, and ISO 1464 3. We will come to that as we go along later on. What it means is that the various applications that we can see from ISO 1460 family is like it helps us to make some corporate decisions and to take some voluntary initiatives, like in terms of carbon offset projects or doing some carbon offsetting. It helps us to mitigate the risks and opportunity with every business. That is a crucial factors on to identify your risk and opportunity, and how ISO 1464 in particular can help you to do that. And also to meet the regulatory and government GHG programs, which are, like if you have a EU programs like CDM in compliance market, or if you have a voluntary program like VCS or gold standard. In Middle East, we have GCC, also Global Carbon Council. These are all the voluntary programs that are currently currently very much active, and the projects are getting registered there in these programs. And then finally, you have the overall GHG markets. Now, how the relationship works is that, as I told you, that ISO 1464 is having three subparts. ISO 1464 1, these are basically the standards which will be used by any organizations, to understand how to design and develop the GHG inventories. Okay, so when I say GHG inventories, needless to say, greenhouse gas inventories. So we talk about various greenhouse gases which are covered under ISO 1460 family, and just not carbon dioxide. So, and then we come to ISO 1464. ISO 1464 part 2, these are basically specify, quantify, monitor, and report your emission reductions and removal enhancements. So the first thing is your designing part, where you design, develop, and then make a GHG inventory report based on your scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. And then in order to your ongoing quantification and monitoring of those reported emissions, we follow the standard of ISO 1464 part 2. ISO 1467 is also there, which is also CFP study. If I'm not wrong, it is carbon. Uh, Sorry, I didn't forget that abbreviation, but It's a CFP that we need to perform. It's very rarely used, but for in our interest, we will be doing ISO 14641 and 14642. At the bottom of this, you can see ISO 14643, which is mostly used by the verification or a third-party independent bodies who are basically doing the independent assessment and verifying your GHG reports, which you are going if you want to go for a verification study, and then subsequently publish your GHG report in your annual reports as a part of your annual reports. So this is the relationship of the family of all the ISO 1464 families that we can see here in one shot. Now here, one of the most common, yet one of the most, I would say, very diffused terminology that we keep coming across is what is scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. We keep seeing these words in and around in various internet as well as in various seminars, but often most of us, when we are dealing with it in a practical terms, they kind of not clear to everyone and kind of overlap with one another. So it is very important to identify what are your scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3 emissions. So as per any standards, like in GRI, which is Global Reporting Initiatives, you have to also report your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So as I was telling you earlier also, like ISO 1464 is the mother of everything. So if you are following the standards of ISO 1464, based on that, you are accurately calculating your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, which then later on you can put it into various structures or various programs if you want to report it under GRI, or if you want to further take it into ESG reporting for that, so on and so forth. So what is scope 1 emissions? As you can see, it is a direct emissions in which the companies or any entities, if they are owning or controlling that emissions. Now, prior to coming to scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, I would also like to emphasize on there are other type of emissions which we call the direct emissions and indirect emissions. So direct emissions are the one which are directly, as the name implies, directly produced by any resources. For example, if you have a gas-based turbine which is producing electricity as well as a steam, if it is a cogen-based turbine, then that becomes your direct source of emissions. Now there are, again, it is subcategorized into different ways, like you have direct stationary emissions and direct mobile emissions. So when I say stationary emissions, it is referring to the resources or the assets like boilers, chillers, and if I'm not the wind turbines for that examples, these all comes under the direct source of emissions. Even in mobile, you have a direct mobile emissions in case if you are having any fleet which is generating electricity. For example, if you are having a DG set which is installed in your mobile fleet, like cargo ships and everything, that will fall under your direct mobile emissions. Similar to that, we have indirect emissions, in which it is not directly coming from the source, generating from the source, but it is a part which is coming from the source. Uh, Good example of this, and the simplest one, is that let's say we are using the grid electricity, and then with the help of grid electricity, we are further in the downstream, we are further generating electricity or any other different types of heating applications. So that will refer to as an indirect applications, which will typically that is coming in the process. So now broadly, if we are looking into scope 1 and scope 2, as I told earlier, the scope 1 is the one of the direct emissions which are owned by the company vehicles and the manufacturing facilities. Scope 2 are the emissions which are generated from the purchased electricity, steam, heating, and cooling. So I am based in Middle East, so heating applications is very rare. But then in industrial, if you go to the industries in UAE, where a lot of thermal applications are required, like paper industry, or if you are working in cement industry or ceramic industry, so that heating part, which is you need to account it in indirect emissions. Then you have a scope 3 emissions, which is a very broad category, and it actually we refers it for the emissions which you take in your entire value chain of your business. Like commonly, which we consider in scope 3 emissions, like business travels, investments, or any equipment like chillers or something which is coming to its end of life, and you are doing any sort of retrofits or treatments, due to which there is some emissions which has been incurred uh, in order to prolong his life cycle. That will come under a scope 3 emissions. There are a lot of other various examples, and this is where the things gets a bit complicated when you need to report a scope 3 emissions, primarily because of the availability of the data, which are very difficult to get in some cases. But apart from that, the another difficulty that the scope 3 emissions presents is that the overlapping with often with the scope 2 emissions, I would say. So in this say webinar, we are just touching the elementary parts of these terminologies, and then in the subsequent seminars we will take each topics and go a hands-on minute details on that. So as you can see, this is the diagrammatic approach which you can refer to for the scope 1, scope 2. I know many of us have have come across this diagram, but it's very comprehensive. Just to highlight here, if we are working on any energy retrofit projects or any energy efficiency projects, we often try to understand how much is my energy saving, and then to quantify it with the amount of carbon dioxide reductions that has happened with that process. ISO 1464 standards says that apart from CO2, you need to include every greenhouse gas that is being stipulated and identified by UNFCCC. So apart from CO2, we have methane, nitrous oxide, HFC, PFC, and SF6. SF6 you can find mostly in the transformers, as I would say. HFC you will find mostly in the refrigerant sides of any cooling media. And then of course you have a methane, where you can find any sort of an aerobic or forestry projects. If someone is dealing with agriculture or forestry, you can have a significant methane emissions. And then CO2 is by default, it is sort of a byproduct which is coming from any emissions that we hear about. So yes, this is the diagrammatic relationship that I can talk about. As I was talking about the gases that is covered. So while you are talking about carbon or you are talking about corporate GHG accounting, when we are talking about that, we are talking about all the gases which are covered under UNFCCC. So this is most important. You have to identify not only CO2, but also the other potential sources of emissions. The default, you can find the default emission factors. If you want to go ahead with the default emission factors and try to understand how they are interlinked with their GWP, I would suggest to refer IPCC reports. So you can check it in online. When you go to IPCC reports, it will tell you the global warming potential of each and every greenhouse gas that is present there. And from there we can understand the potential impact of what the greenhouse gas has in comparison to CO2. That's why when we are talking about the other gases emissions, we generally refer to as CO2 equivalent, right? So how does we go about the accounting? These are some of the, I tried to simplify it by a stepwise approach. First is, of course, in any projects, whether it is any sort of greenhouse gas accounting or any project that we do, we have to set boundaries. We need to understand what is my start and end point, and then I need to define that in my report. And from there, I will try to assess what are my emissions step by steps. So setting boundaries is one of the most first and preliminary step. Then collection of data. Then collection of data is, for examples, you now there are two types of data again that we commonly refer to when we in our industries. One is primary data and the other is secondary data. Primary data are the data which we generally get hands-on, like by measurements or by from directly from any online meters. Okay, so these are the first-hand information that you get is called primary data. Secondary data is generally usually through any reports. For example, if you are getting, let's say, you are doing a biomass survey, so you have a biomass quantification from a third party, so that becomes your secondary data. For example, if you are using natural gas in your facility, and you are getting calorific value from the natural gas supplier every fortnight or every monthly, that becomes your secondary data. So again, why I am mentioning all these terminology is that when you are preparing a GHG report and when you are preparing a full-fledged carbon accounting report, you need to specify the sources of data and the categories of data. It is very important. Apart from that, then third step is, of course, once you have the data collected, you need to also do the sanity check of the data, that the whether the data that you have collected is how true the data is. So this is where the base year reference comes into the picture, which we will be talking about, how to identify the base year. And let's assume that you have a good sanity check and you have collected the data, and then now you are in your next step where you will be calculating emissions. Now, typically what I have generally seen in most of the organization, without, they do not break it down in scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. They simply report it that, okay, this is my total emissions that is coming from my operations or my process, and this is what I achieve to do in order to avoid that. This is, however, ISO doesn't tells or doesn't mandates that you need to break it down in various scopes. But in practical terms, if you are executing any project, or once you have identified your emissions, if you are not breaking it down in scope 1 or scope 2 emissions, you won't be able to identify what are the emissions which are in your scopes or in your control, and which are unavoidable. So based on that, you can then plan your next steps, which is implementing the various actions or strategies in order to reduce those scope 2 emissions, and then whatever the balance is, we can generally go and purchase it through any offsets or through various carbon management programs. Once all these steps are done, then it is also very important that to get your report verified and uh, for its confidence level from a third party. uh, Generally people are not doing that, and this is moving forward, it will definitely become a mandate. Recently, in my recent interaction with one of the oil and gas client, the client has done the GHG report and has simply included it in their annual reports. But during audits or during their financial audit, a third party or consultant or was who came for an audit, they wanted that the verification of the confidence level of the emissions that they claim that they have reduced or the targets that they have achieved. So it is very important to have a different eye on your report altogether once you have prepare the report. So these are the 4 steps. Yeah, these are the types of GHG emissions which I was talking earlier. Then you have a direct GHG emissions and removals. Then you have an indirect GHG emissions, which are from the imported energies. Indirect GHG emissions from the transportations. Indirect GHG emissions from the products which are used by the organizations. So for example, like I can give you like a paint industry, paint manufacturing industry. So in paint manufacturing industries, the indirect GHG emissions can be referred to as various types of VOCs, which comes from the paints. So these are the type of indirect GHG emissions from the product itself, which comes into the picture. Then you have the indirect GHG emission associated with the use of products. So for examples, I can easily say that, for example, here, uh, if you are in a Middle East and if you are using subsequent amount of air conditioning, any sort of leakage, or of course, we can consider it as a part of the leakage, but that refers to as indirect GHG emissions as well, which are coming from your air conditioning. This is one of the examples I am touching upon. And then you have indirect GHG emissions from various other sources. These all the categories you need to identify when you are doing your GHG report and at the facility level, and you have to categorize and report them. So not simply, understanding that, okay, this is my total GHG emissions and reporting it. That is not the correct approach actually, which is being done by some of the players in the market right now. Category 1, we go in brief details of how the what is the direct GHG emissions. They occur from the GHG sources and sinks that are inside your organizational boundaries and are owned and controlled by in the organization. So example of these two sources can be stationary, which I already given an example earlier, like you have heaters, electric generators, and then industrial process, mobiles, it can be a mobile GHG emissions as well. If, for example, if you have a vehicles. The second category is indirectly GHG emissions. Again, then this category is again falls for the GHG emissions for the fuel consumption associated with the production of final electricities and utilities. Again, such as electricity, heat, steam, cooling, and compressed air. So it excludes any sort of upstream emissions. For example, if you are in oil and gas, so any sort of an upstream emissions which occurs when you are doing any extraction process. So it doesn't includes that. It is only focusing on your downstream process. So that's why the setting of the boundary, which I was talking about earlier, is very important. And then you have a category 3, which is again, very easy. Like you, in case of transport or business travels, you can consider it again a sort of a category 3 emissions. Okay. Yeah. We have another type of category 4 emissions as well. Okay. This sort of emissions are usually occur from the sources which are located outside your boundaries or organizational boundaries, I would say. Again, they can be mobile or stationary depending upon the type of the sources which you need to identify. For example, extraction of any raw material. So for example, if you are in a coal mining industries, or so the from the extraction of the raw coal or any lignite, so the emissions that are coming from those processes comes under the category 4 emissions. Transportation of those raw materials between the suppliers. So if you have a supplier 1 and supplier 2, the transportation which is happening between them, the emissions that comes from that part comes under the category 4 emissions. And then the manufacturing and the processing of the raw materials is also coming under this category as well. Category 5. So GHG emissions or removals associated with the use of products from the organizational result from the products sold by the organization during the life stage occurring after the organization production process. It means that any products after the organization sells to its end customer, the emissions that comes out of it comes under the category 5 emissions. For example, any OEM or any supplier who have sold an air conditioner, and during its operating life, if it is having an emissions, any HFC emissions is happening because of various reasons, let's say during its servicing or AMC or any sort of retrofit, or during installation or commissioning, that we will take it into account as category 5 emissions. Now, organizational boundaries, which we were talking about, this is again the most important thing and the beginning before you even start proceeding and calculating your emissions levels. There are two approaches under which you need to identify your organizational boundaries. One is the control approach, and the other is the equity share approach. Now, what is the control approach? Control approach is where the organization has 100% accountability or control over the process and the GHG emissions. So again, the control can be two types. It can be financial or it can be operational. For example, a company A is having a full control on its process. What it means is that it is a deciding body in terms of the raw material production, in terms of the type of the products that is being produced. We define it under the control approach. It can be also the financial terms, where the company is holding the financial decisions for its process or for its operation. That can also come under your control approach. Now, then we have the equity share approach. So what is the equity share approach? Equity share approach is the percentage of economic interest. The equity share approach can be particularly useful for any multinational companies who have presence not only in one location but spread across the globe, where different jurisdictions are aiming to determine their GHG inventories and their scopes are different. So it is very important for us also to report this clearly while defining boundaries, that what is the approach we are following here, whether it is a control approach or a equity share approach. Yeah. So for any project or anything that we do, we fix a reference year, which we call the base year. So for example, I see most of here also coming from the professional energy background. They can relate to this, that we define a baseline year, which is typically called the base year GHG inventory. So we need to identify the emissions and we need to identify a period in which we need to account whatever the emissions that has happened for this year. This can be usually a 1 year data, but typically we go for a multi-year data, let's say a 3-year data. For a new facility, if you want to if you want to prepare a GHG report and you don't have a previous year data, then you can take the current year as your reference year and then subsequently build upon it. In energy or in any other projects, the base year remains fixed. You cannot change the base year. It remains fixed, and then throughout the crediting period of that project. But in ISO, as per ISO 1464, the standard says that a entity or an organization can review the base years if there is any substantial changes that has happened in the organization. For example, if in your company there is a merger or acquisition happened, or if there is a facility that has been added up, there is a capacity addition in your production process. So this is going to impact your base year. So for that, you need to again reassess your base year, and based on that, you need to define your targets. So these things you need to keep it in mind. When we go into the standards, it is as per the clause 6.4.1. I am not putting all the clauses here, which will make the presentations very boring and lengthy. So that's why we are talking about here, touching the key and main clauses and the topics which are as per ISO 1464 standard. So once you have identified the base year, then you have calculated your emissions and have segregated that. You have identified what are the potential steps that you need to take. You go ahead and take the mitigation activities. Again, I have list down some of the mitigation activities categories which you can look into: energy demand and usage management, energy efficiency, technology or process improvements, GHG capture and storage, fuel switching, management of transport and travel demands, afforestation for those who are working in forestry projects or agriculture projects, I would say, waste minimization for people or who are working from waste to energy projects, alternative fuels and raw materials used to avoid landfillings. For people who are working in cement, for the clinker process, this is one of the alternative fuels and raw materials that are used for brick manufacturing. Then you have, of course, refrigerant management, where if you deal with the various air conditioning improvement and leakage improvement projects. Once you have identified and you have implemented, you have some balance emissions which you seem that it is unavoidable. In order, if a company is going ahead and trying to implement a net zero or decarbonization strategies whatsoever, they wish to go ahead and purchase the remaining emissions through some offsets. So you have international REC certificates, you have VCS credits, and then there are clean air certificates. Especially in Middle East, you have clean air certificates, and there is another program which is operating in Middle East, which is called GCC, Global Carbon Council. You can go and check this in the website. It is a third party independent body. It is actually a certification body which registers and identifies the projects for its genuineness for the carbon reductions and offsets mechanisms. Before we understand how much we need to reduce, how much we need to offset, we need to define the targets, right? So the GHG targets, again, you can see from the slides I have listed down, there are several types of categories in which you can set the targets. If you see, there is climate science, reduction potential, international and national context in terms of if you have any policies or any mandate that is coming from the government, and then sectorial context. For example, in particularly in India, if I see, you are not to do the incinerate, you are not to release the toxic or VOCs into the stacks just like that. You need to incinerate that. So that is again a sectoral specific and also on a national specific context, I would say. So targets is very essential here. There are two types of targets. One is your intensity, and the other is your absolute target. So again, it's there is no hard and fast rule which target you need to choose. It depends upon your organization nature and what is the type of targets that you wish to go ahead. When I say intensity target, it's generally like we are talking about tons of CO2 reduction per ton of product. Okay, so per ton of product can be per ton of let's say a clinker produced, or per ton of anything like it's basically a specific energy consumption matrix that we are referring to. When we are talking about absolute targets, we simply have a fixed targets. When we talk about, let's say, we will reduce it by 10% than the reference year, or we can simply say that we are going to reduce 10,000 tons of CO2 in next 3 years. So this becomes the absolute target. The other one, intensity, which I talk about, is the relative target. You can take it, think it like that. Uncertainty in every measurement, in everything we do, there is always a human error which is there. And so ISO standard 1464, also as per clause 8.3, there is a clause in which you need to identify what is your uncertainty level. And to minimize this uncertainty level, there are various models which can be used, which we will be talking about maybe in the later webinar. There is a different ISO standard altogether, which talks about the uncertainties levels that you need to consider based on your sampling approach. Uh, but for now, an uncertainty approach can be minimized to a lot if you are having a third party verification or certification on your GHG reports. So that reduces your uncertainty, because the more the uncertainty is there in your GHG report, you will not be accurately measuring your targets. And if you are not measuring accurately your targets, you are not you will not be in a position to identify whether you have achieved the targets in real terms or not. So that becomes a question mark always. You will carry a question mark on your report always. So if someone is interested, for now, they can also refer to this ISO standard, which I have mentioned here in the bottom, ISO IEC Guide 98.3, where you can find the details, further details on the approach of how to take about on the uncertainty level. Now, the typical skeleton of the GHG report is also very straightforwardly defined in your ISO 1464 standards. So your typical GHG report contains, starts with the description of the project, what is the reporting organization, about the organization itself, the person, the responsible entity who is prepared for the report or who is the authorizing person, and also the period that you are covered in the report. For example, if you are covering 3 years or a 5 year data in your report, so it should be transparently mentioned here. As I told, you need to categorically mention your organizational boundaries very clearly. Then you need to include what are your direct and indirect GHG sources, and if possible and as a good practice, you can further segregate it as a scope 1 and scope 2 emissions as well. This will be a very good detail. Now, the people who are working in the carbon management or in a CDM, or let's say in a VCS projects, or a validator or a consultant, they know that, okay, these templates, they follow a similar sort of templates. So what I mean to say is that even in energy audits, or we follow a similar template. So what I mean to say is that the crux or the basis of the preparation of these templates come from this ISO 1464. So the more details and the knowledge you will gather on this standard, it will help you to deal with the other subsequent or a derivative projects, which can be GRI, ESG reporting, or energy reporting, anything. So just to categorize, giving some of the examples, the list is very exhaustive. Yes, we can go on to talk about it, the scope 1, scope 2 in a length, but this is one of the I thought, sector wise, I would classify energy generation, oil and gas, coal mining. You can understand from here what are the typical scope 1 emission sources, scope 2 and scope 3 emission sources. So these are helpful data to start with, particularly if someone is new and working in these sectors. So to start reporting on a GHG, they can do this sector-wise categorization. There are multiple sectors, and every sectors, again, you have a complex sectors like agriculture and forestry, where it's very difficult also people initially to understand what is scope 2 and scope 3 emissions. Yeah, so again, like in HFC 22, so which we commonly call as R22 productions. So if you are having refrigerant gas R22 productions, what comes under scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3? The leftmost, the first column talks, the second column talks about scope 1, and the fourth column talks about scope 3. And then there are other sectors at the bottom. In case you are falling into any SMEs or any type and still you want to report on your GHG emissions, you can use this as a generic, which comes under other sectors or office based, which are typically, office organization or consulting companies. They can adopt this part, which falls under other sectors category. So yes, this is the end of this short webinar that we have conducted, and thank you once again for being here with me and patiently hearing me. So this is where, after this, we can definitely go ahead and we will have a more detailed sessions on each and every technicalities. So this is one of the initial and technically seminars, webinar, I would say, that we have conducted just to bring you hands-on or bring up to your speed on the terminology. So any questions, we can take it.
Yeah, I've got one message from Wakar Ahmed. I'll just wait a minute, Mr. Wakar. Yeah, now you can unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, Mr.
I have actually put the question in the chat box as well, but I will mention here that actually when we are reporting our GHG emissions, okay, while compiling a report, can you please let me know like which standard we need to follow? Either in GHG protocol, it is saying to mention it like as scope 1, 2, and 3, whereas in ISO 14064, it is categorized in category 1 to 6. So I know they are same, but how to report it? Like, should we mention in the way of scope 1, 2, 3, or should we mention as like category 1 to up to 6?
No, yeah. So thank you for the question. Actually, yes, in ISO 1464, the categorized is categorized as from 1 to 6. But if you observe carefully, these categories 1 to 6, they eventually fall under these three scopes broadly: scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. So if you have developed your GHG report in line with GHG protocol, or if you want to further take it forward for GRI reporting, or for ESG reporting, I would recommend to go ahead and report your emissions on scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have another question from Pitstop. Let me just accept it.
Okay. So the next,
I would like to know whether the use of electric vehicles and the resultant the batteries used. So calculating the GHG emissions from the battery cradle life to the end comes under which scope?
so again, there is as you mentioned in your questions, that use of electric vehicles and battery used from cradle to end. So when we say cradle, do you mean to say the manufacturing of the batteries itself?
Yes. So that is, so we include in the scope of us the manufacturing of these batteries.
No, if you are the end user, are you the end user of the electric vehicles or you are on the manufacturing side?
I'm end user, I'm saying.
If you are on the end user, the manufacturing of the battery will not be included in your scope. So
Okay.
don't consider it. You have to only report on the scope 2 emissions, which are indirect emission from the use of electric vehicles.
Fine. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, there is another question from, wait a minute, just.
Okay, so I have this question from OJ, if I am.
Yeah,
Hello?
good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the presentation. So the
Thank you.
question I want to ask is that I understand sometimes it's a little difficult accounting for scope 3 emissions. So I'm asking to get your professional point of view on how to account for scope 3 emissions, and also what best measures would you advise from a professional point of view on accounting for scope 3 emissions?
Yeah. So, scope 3 becomes difficult in terms of your getting the data. If you want to simplify your scope 3 emissions, the first measure is you need to define your project boundary very, very clearly. People start having a project boundary from let's say from point A to B, and then when they subsequently go in the process and start developing the GHG reported, they kind of forget, and it kind of get diffused, and they don't ultimately know where they need to start and from where they need to stop. So you need to have a very clear defined project boundary. once you have a Once you have a project boundary clearly defined, it will help you to you know understand that what are the type of emissions that is happening inside that boundary, right? So that will be a very good I would say a starting point for you when you are dealing with scope 3. Now let's say you have understand that, okay, now if you are let's say you are working in a consulting group. Okay, now if for your the scope 3 emissions, will be the any business related travels, or any or the employees who are commuting to work from their home, that will come under the scope 3 emissions. So why? Because here you have considered the boundary as your office buildings, or the consulting your office buildings as your project boundary. So you are not bothered of what is happening outside your project boundary. Second thing, to identify the scope 3 emissions, why it becomes difficult is that the availability of the data. Now, the availability of data in scope 3 becomes very challenging because it is one of the most ignored type of emissions that we don't care about. That's why we don't have a data, simply. Scope 2 emissions, people are mostly concerned about, and because that's what affects your bottom line, and it's a revenue generation, how much you are consuming the electricity, how much you are generating. So that becomes directly impacting your profit or impacting your bottom line. So this is why people are measuring it, people are monitoring it. So you have the data available. The things people and scope 3 is something which people thinks they are not, this is not contributing to their business profit or losses, so that's why they don't keep a track of it. So getting a data is the most important and most challenging part of reporting a scope 3 emissions. I hope I able to answer your question. Hello.
Yes, please. I think that's very useful. Thanks so much. I work as a consultant who have had experience to work on scope 3, and it's sometimes really very challenging, especially when your client demands that you report for everything possible. So, but putting putting a boundary that is very well defined, I think it's useful. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, there is another question from Mr. Wakar Ahmed here.
Yeah.
Mr. Ahmed? You can unmute yourself. Is not active, so
Okay, I can see the question here. In the chat box, it is written that for construction companies, civil and MEP contractors, how would they need to report their scope 3 emissions? How scope 3 category 1 purchase materials will be accounted for contractors, knowing that they don't have any direct control on the type of material or purchase of construction of the buildings. I'm not sure about the question clearly, but if I understand correctly, you want to understand for a construction companies, how can they report for scope 3 if they are from MEP for the MEP or civil contractors? See, first of all, if any MEP contractor is working for any company, if they wanted to account what is their scope 3 emissions, for them, it will be their logistics, I would say. That is one of their main emissions. The logistic, when I say logistics, it means the labors that, they are using for that particular project, the transportation from their labor accommodation to the site and then back to the labor accommodation, that becomes your main scope 3 emissions. And anything which you are like the traveling or any commuting that you are doing for particularly for that type of project, you need to report it in scope 3 emissions. Now, second part of your question, which says how scope 3 category 1 purchased material will be accounted for the contractors. I don't think it needs to be accounted at all, because again, then you are going outside your project boundary. It is not in your project boundary. The purchase material, first of all, scope 3 emissions will be accounted by the party or by an entity who has produced that particular material which you are using at your site. So this is not something in your control, and this is, first of all, you are the end user of that purchased material. So you don't need to report for that scope 3 emissions. Yes, you need to report it if you are for example, if you are bringing that purchased material from the warehouse to your site, that you can consider under your scope, because that becomes your coming under your project boundary, and it is affecting your value chain process. Any other questions?
no, I believe there's no question after this. So, so thank you, everyone. Mr. Zovic, you please close it from me.
Yeah, so from my side, yes, thanks for everyone. As I said again, this will be the first of many webinars. Please keep a watch, follow our page in LinkedIn. We are coming up with various topics, various technical topics, advanced topics, which are currently in buzz in the market, and how you can adapt yourself on that. And we will be discussing on this. I know this is this particular webinar may be very elementary or for some of you. For some of you, I hope it is a learning session. But moving ahead, yes, we will be talking about much more on our technical sphere. And in case if you want to understand more about GHG reporting or carbon accounting, please feel free to drop a message to Ms. Swati or to me, and we can definitely assist you on that part in more details.
Yes. So thank you, everyone. And regarding the presentation, as I've seen some messages to share this presentation with you all. So we will be putting this session on our YouTube channel. So, and the link will be shared with you through email. So you can anytime access this from that link. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice weekend.